He was charming, elegant, and utterly untouchable. A man who looked like a diplomat, spoke like a professor, and conned the most powerful men in Europe and America without ever pulling a gun. In 1925, he sold the Eiffel Tower, not once, but twice, then vanished into the fog of history like a magician. His name was Victor Lustig. The world called him the greatest con artist who ever lived. But his crimes weren't just clever, they were art. This is not just a story of fraud. It's a psychological thriller, a real-life heist movie with no violence, no victims, and no remorse. Get ready for the unbelievable true story of the man who sold the Eiffel Tower and nearly sold the American dream. Stay till the end, because this story only gets crazier. They say some people are born to con. If that's true, then Victor Lustig must have been the blueprint. Before he became the man who sold the Eiffel Tower, before he scammed gangsters and governments alike, he was just a boy. A boy with sharp eyes, quick hands, and a brain wired for mischief. Victor Lustig was born on January 4, 1890, in Hostin, a small town in what is now the Czech Republic. At the time, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Victor's family was comfortably middle class. Not royalty, not peasants, just enough money to live well, but not enough to feel powerful. And for young Victor, that was never going to be enough. Even as a teenager, Lustig stood out. He was fluent in multiple languages: German, Czech, French, and later, English. He was charming, impeccably dressed, and always knew what to say to make people trust him. But behind that elegant smile was a restless mind constantly calculating, constantly scheming. He enrolled in school in Paris and later traveled across Europe, supposedly as a student. But his education didn't come from textbooks. His real classroom was the casinos, racetracks, and smoky bars where wealthy men let their guard down. That's where Lustig learned his trade, the art of the confidence trick. Unlike the crude thieves of the street, Lustig was something different. He didn't snatch wallets. He didn't sneak through windows. He asked people to hand him their money, and they did it willingly. That's the terrifying genius of a con artist. They make you believe it was your idea all along. By the time he reached his early 20s, Victor had built a reputation as a master manipulator. He had the manners of a nobleman, the instincts of a predator, and the patience of a chess master. Wherever he went, from Berlin to Vienna to Rome, he left behind confused victims, empty wallets, and no trace of himself. He wasn't chasing money. Not really. He was chasing the thrill, the high of outsmarting powerful men, of walking through the front door in a tailored suit, lying through his teeth, and being believed. But Victor Lustig didn't want to be just another clever criminal. No, he was planning something bigger, much bigger. And soon, he'd find himself in the heart of Paris, staring up at the most famous monument in the world, and thinking to himself, I wonder, how much would someone pay to own the Eiffel Tower? Victor Lustig didn't become a legend overnight. His genius wasn't in one big scam, it was in the dozens, maybe hundreds of smaller ones that came before. Each one was a step in his self-made education. And with each victim, he learned more about the one thing he could control better than anyone else: trust. His weapon of choice? A briefcase. His favorite stage? A luxury train carriage or a hotel lounge. And his masterpiece? Something so absurd, so bold, it sounds like fiction: the Romanian money box. It looked simple, a polished mahogany box with brass fittings and dials on the front. Victor would call it a miracle of modern science, a machine that could duplicate any banknote placed inside. Of course, it needed time. He'd insert a genuine $100 bill, turn the crank slowly, and tell his victim to be patient. The chemical process takes 6 hours, he'd say in a smooth, convincing tone. And 6 hours later, the box would spit out another perfect $100 bill, a real one, pulled from Victor's own stash. The mark was astonished. He watched it happen again and again. Each time, Victor played it perfectly. A little impatient, a little secretive, just skeptical enough to seem real. The victim, now seeing proof of the machine's power, begged to buy it. Lustig always hesitated, acted reluctant. Eventually, he'd agree, at a price. $10,000. Sometimes more. By the time the victim realized they'd bought an empty box filled with nothing but gears and lies, Lustig was already across the border. That was just one of many schemes. Victor worked cruise ships, claiming to be a wealthy count. He posed as a businessman selling invisible ink to gullible investors. Once, he even pretended to be a musical talent agent and tricked singers into paying him for fake auditions. He had no fixed identity, no fixed location, only aliases, charm, and a suitcase full of perfectly rehearsed lies. But Victor Lustig wasn't a common thief. He had rules. He even wrote them down, 10 commandments for con men. One of them read, "Be a patient listener. It is this, not fast talking, that gets a con man his victims." Another, "Never look bored." But the most chilling rule of all? Never get greedy. Just take what you need and disappear. It was this discipline, this cold, calculated artistry that made him different. He wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing belief. And yet, even with all his scams, all his brilliance, Victor Lustig hadn't even scratched the surface of what he was capable of. The real con, the one that would make him a legend, was waiting for him in Paris. By 1925, Paris was still healing from the scars of World War I. The City of Lights had lost some of its sparkle. Money was tight, morale was low, and in the middle of the skyline stood the Eiffel Tower, tall, proud, and deeply unpopular. Back then, the Eiffel Tower wasn't the icon it is today. To many Parisians, it was an eyesore, a rusting skeleton of iron beams that cost a fortune to maintain. Rumors even swirled in the papers, whispers that the French government was considering tearing it down. For Victor Lustig, that rumor wasn't just gossip. It was an opportunity, a perfect opportunity. Lustig arrived in Paris and checked into the luxurious Hotel de Crillon, one of the finest in the city. He wore a tailored suit, carried a cane, and introduced himself as Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. He had fake government stationery, official-looking documents, and even a forged government seal. Every detail was flawless. But Victor knew that for a con to work, it needed more than props. It needed performance. He contacted 5 of the city's top scrap metal dealers, powerful businessmen who had made fortunes tearing down old buildings and melting them for profit. He summoned them to a private meeting at the hotel, saying it concerned a highly confidential government project. They came, curious, skeptical, and were ushered into a gilded conference room. There, Victor stood waiting, posture perfect, expression serious. And then, he told them the lie that would make him a legend. He explained that the government had made a difficult decision. Due to skyrocketing maintenance costs, the Eiffel Tower was going to be dismantled and sold for scrap metal. But, and this was critical, the public didn't know yet. The project was highly sensitive. Discretion was mandatory. Lustig's tone was solemn, professional. He presented documents, charts, maintenance figures. And then he said something that made the men lean in. "We are seeking a reliable contractor, someone discreet, to handle the salvage operation. And one of you will be selected." It wasn't just a lie, it was a privilege. He made them feel like insiders, trusted, chosen. The men didn't question the logic. They questioned only how to win the bid. Among the group was André Poisson, a man desperate to prove himself. He was wealthy, yes, but new to the game, lacked the swagger of the old money elite. And Victor smelled that insecurity like blood in the water. Over the next few days, Lustig met privately with Poisson, took him to dinners, flattered his intelligence, let him feel like he was the favorite. And just before sealing the deal, Lustig added one more layer to the con. He told Poisson that, privately, he was underpaid as a government official and would appreciate a token of gratitude to ensure the paperwork moved quickly. It was a bribe, but framed as a favor, a gentle nudge in a rigged system. Poisson didn't hesitate. He paid both the fee and the full amount for the scrap contract, a sum worth hundreds of thousands in today's money. And within 24 hours, Victor Lustig vanished. No trace, no trail, not even a shadow. Poussin waited and waited. Days passed. No permits. No follow-up. Finally, he went to the government office himself and discovered the truth. There was no plan to demolish the Eiffel Tower. No auction. No Victor Lustig. He had been completely deceived. But here's the genius part. Poussin never reported the crime. Because he was too ashamed. To admit he'd been conned so perfectly and so publicly would destroy his reputation. And Victor Lustig knew that. He counted on it. Most con artists would have taken the win and disappeared forever. Not Victor. He came back to Paris and tried it again. He set up another round of meetings with new dealers. But this time, one of them got suspicious. He contacted the police before any money changed hands. Lustig escaped, barely, and fled to the United States. But by then, the legend had already spread. A man who sold the Eiffel Tower, not once, but twice. The newspapers never caught his real name. Interpol couldn't trace him. He had no fingerprints, no fixed identity. Just a suitcase full of charm and forged documents. Victor Lustig didn't steal the Eiffel Tower. He sold an idea, an illusion, and walked away with a fortune. Most con men know when to quit. Victor Lustig wasn't one of them. He just pulled off one of the most audacious scams in history, selling the Eiffel Tower. And not only did he get away with it, he got away clean. The victim didn't go to the police. There were no charges, no chase, no name in the papers. But Victor Lustig wasn't interested in safe endings. He was addicted to the rush. So, after vanishing with a suitcase full of francs, he did something that defies all logic. He came back to Paris. Same hotel, same fake identity, same story. This time, Lustig selected a new group of scrap metal dealers, businessmen who hadn't heard the whispers about his first con. Once again, he summoned them to a private meeting under the guise of a secret government contract. The Eiffel Tower, he claimed, was still set to be dismantled. The first deal had simply fallen through. The pitch was just as convincing. The forged documents just as crisp. The confidence? Flawless. But one of the businessmen had a sharper instinct than Lustig anticipated. Something felt off. Too rushed. Too secretive. Too good to be true. Instead of taking the bait, the man contacted the authorities. Quietly, cautiously. By the time the French police arrived at the hotel, the room was empty. No Victor Lustig. No sign of the fake ministry. Just a lingering scent of expensive cologne and a trail of deception. Victor knew Paris was no longer safe. Europe was growing smaller for a man like him. So he crossed the Atlantic and slipped into the roaring heart of 1920s America, a land of opportunity, excess, and crime. He arrived in New York under yet another false name and immediately got to work. But this time, his target wasn't a naive scrap dealer. It was the most dangerous criminal in the country. Yes, that Al Capone, the king of Chicago, the most feared gangster in America. Most men wouldn't dare speak Capone's name, let alone look him in the eye. But Lustig asked for a meeting. In a smoky room surrounded by armed guards, he pitched Capone a deal. Give me $50,000 to invest. I'll double it in 60 days. No questions asked. Capone agreed, cautiously. He handed over the money. And for 2 months, Victor didn't invest a dime. Instead, he kept it locked away in a safe. 60 days later, he returned to Capone, not with double, but with the same $50,000. He claimed the deal had fallen through, and he was returning the full amount. Capone was stunned. Who does that? Victor played the part of a disappointed, honorable man, a rare thing in Capone's brutal world. The gangster, moved by his honesty, handed Lustig a $5,000 reward. That was the con. That was the heist. He scammed Al Capone without ever touching his money. At this point, Victor Lustig wasn't just a con artist. He was a phantom. He had over 45 known aliases, spoke 5 languages fluently, and left behind a trail of lies so clever, law enforcement couldn't keep up. He once said, "I had a natural instinct for the weaknesses of other people." It wasn't arrogance. It was observation. He didn't need to run fast. He just needed to stay one step ahead. And for years, he did exactly that. But Victor Lustig's world was getting smaller. His name, or at least his many names, began appearing in FBI reports. Bankers whispered, detectives compared notes. Orders grew tighter. And yet, even as the noose began to tighten, Victor Lustig wasn't done conning. Not by a long shot. By the late 1920s, Victor Lustig was no longer a wandering conman. He was an industry. Luxury hotels, tailored suits, diamond cufflinks. He wasn't just pretending to be wealthy, he was wealthy. But what no one could explain was how. There was no business, no office, no traceable income. What Lustig had was a machine, or so he claimed. He called it the Romanian money box, the same gimmick he'd once used on trains across Europe. But now, the box was more elaborate. He had several versions, each built to look like a real mechanical marvel. Heavy oak frames, dials, levers, polished brass, and a slit where money would slowly emerge. He told his victims it was a government prototype, a chemical duplicator, top secret, stolen from a lab, dangerous, priceless. Then he'd insert a genuine $100 bill, turn the crank slowly, and after a dramatic pause, the box would print another flawless $100 note. Identical, undetectable. Of course, what the victim didn't know was that Lustig had already loaded the machine with real bills, pre-inserted behind a hidden panel. It only appeared to print them. He'd tell them, it takes 6 hours per bill. The chemical process needs time. The victim, dazzled by the promise of infinite wealth, would hand over thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, for the machine. Then they'd take it home. 6 hours later, they'd get their second bill. Another 6, a third. But eventually, the machine stopped working, because there was nothing inside. By the time the truth sank in, Lustig was gone. He ran this con all over America. New York, Chicago, Kansas City, Dallas. Sometimes he'd scam rich businessmen. Other times, small-town bankers or crooked sheriffs. No one suspected a well-dressed, articulate gentleman of being a criminal mastermind. He was polite, charming, almost boring in the way that puts people at ease. And behind the scenes, he was building a network. Forged documents, counterfeit notes, bribed insiders. He wasn't just selling fake machines, he was creating a supply chain of fraud. At one point, he was believed to be passing thousands of fake bills a week into the US economy, and no one could trace the source. Banks were baffled. The Secret Service was furious. And Victor Lustig? He was sitting in a suite at the Waldorf Astoria, reading the paper over champagne. But in every legend, there's a flaw. And Victor Lustig made his first real mistake in New Orleans. He tried to bribe a federal agent. Not with charm, but with actual cash. The agent pretended to accept, and then reported him. Within days, the Secret Service had a file. They connected the dots. The aliases. The sudden bursts of counterfeit bills. And in 1935, after a decade of chasing ghosts, they finally had a name. Victor Lustig. But even with a target on his back, Lustig didn't run. He thrived on pressure. Danger was just part of the performance. And while the government prepared to bring him down, Lustig was already thinking one step ahead. He would escape arrest, escape prison, and in one final act of madness, he'd escape Alcatraz itself. By 1935, Victor Lustig's name was finally on a federal most wanted list. The Secret Service had pieced it together. The Eiffel Tower con, the fake money printers, the mountain of counterfeit cash flooding US banks. He wasn't just a fraudster. He was a national threat to the financial system. And yet, Lustig remained calm, confident, almost amused. But this time, his luck was out. In May 1935, federal agents finally caught him in New York. It was a quiet morning. Lustig was walking down Fifth Avenue, wearing a gray suit and a silk tie, calm as ever. 2 agents approached him. And in a moment that could only belong to Victor Lustig, he smiled and said, "Gentlemen, you got me." No struggle, no chase, just a polite surrender, as if being arrested was just another part of the game. They searched his apartment. Inside, they found trunks of forged documents, fake passports, and thousands in counterfeit bills. The Romanian money box was there too, a symbol of the con that had fooled hundreds. The evidence was overwhelming. Victor Lustig was indicted for counterfeiting, mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. He faced decades behind bars. But Lustig had other plans. While awaiting trial in a high-security detention center in Manhattan, Lustig pulled off another incredible trick. He escaped. No tunnels, no explosives, just pure psychology. He fashioned a makeshift rope from bed sheets, disguised himself as a janitor using stolen clothes, and walked past guards while carrying a mop and bucket. The guards barely glanced at him. It was classic Victor. He didn't disappear into shadows, he vanished in plain sight. The city launched a manhunt. Newspapers exploded with headlines. Man who sold Eiffel Tower vanishes from jail. It was a national embarrassment. A phantom had slipped through their fingers again. But his freedom wouldn't last. Lustig was recaptured less than a month later in Pittsburgh. No disguise, no alias, just calm acceptance. This time, the trial moved fast. He pled not guilty, of course, but the evidence was airtight. In 1936, Victor Lustig was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for counterfeiting. He was sent to the one place even he couldn't charm his way out of. Alcatraz. Alcatraz, the Rock, was America's fortress for its most dangerous men. Machine Gun Kelly, Al Capone, and now, Victor Lustig. But inside those cold concrete walls, he wasn't a criminal. He was a celebrity. Other inmates listened to his stories in awe. Even the guards respected his intellect. He was polite, disciplined, always reading. Not violent, not angry, just a man who had beaten the system for longer than anyone else. Still, even the great Victor Lustig couldn't con time. His health began to fail. In 1947, at the age of 57, he died in prison from complications related to pneumonia. His occupation listed on the death certificate? Apprentice salesman. A final wink from a man who had spent his life lying beautifully. Victor Lustig died behind bars, but his legend never did. He wasn't just a thief. He was a master of illusion. A phantom in a tailored suit who made the world believe impossible things. He didn't use violence. He used trust. And that, more than any weapon, is what made him dangerous. Unlike most criminals of his era, Lustig had rules, principles even. In a world of gangsters and bootleggers, he stood out because he never needed a gun. He once wrote his 10 Commandments for Con Men, a secret list later uncovered by authorities. It read like a strange blend of self-help and psychological warfare. Among the most chilling commandments, be a patient listener. It is this, not fast talking, that gets a con man his victims. Never boast. Just let your importance be quietly obvious. Never look bored. Never get drunk. Never lie, unless you're sure the other fellow has already started the deception. It wasn't brute force that made him powerful. It was perception. People wanted to believe him. He let them. Victor Lustig understood something about human nature that most people overlook. We're not tricked because we're stupid. We're tricked because we want to believe. Whether it was the Eiffel Tower scam or the money printer, he offered people what they most desired. A shortcut to power, profit, or prestige. He didn't steal dreams. He sold them. And the people who bought them? They weren't just victims. They were partners in illusion. They played along, right until the curtain dropped. Lustig's life reads like a heist film. Glamorous, surreal, cinematic. But beneath the polished surface was a man always on the run. From law, from time, and maybe even from himself. He escaped countries. He escaped prison. He even escaped Al Capone. But he couldn't escape forever. Still, in a world obsessed with catching criminals, Victor Lustig remains a rare kind. A man who committed crimes and left behind no victims willing to talk. Because admitting you were fooled by Victor Lustig was worse than losing the money. Even in death, he fooled the system one last time. His death certificate read, Apprentice Salesman. Not conman, not fraudster, just a quiet, forgettable job. A final disguise, a final lie. Or maybe after all the masks he wore, That was the closest thing to the truth. Today, Victor Lustig's story lives in textbooks, FBI case files, and whispered legends. He's taught in criminology courses, studied by magicians, admired, sometimes uncomfortably, by psychologists and con artists alike. He didn't steal like a thief. He invited you to hand it over. No violence, no fingerprints, no trace, just a smile and a handshake. Victor Lustig, the man who sold the Eiffel Tower twice, walked through history like a ghost. And ghosts don't leave shadows, only stories.